The early morning air in Santa Monica carried a light ocean breeze, sweeping through the quiet streets as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon. A small cafe near the shore was beginning to fill with regulars, drawn by the familiar comfort of fresh coffee and warm pastries. At a corner table by the window, a man sat with slow, deliberate movements, stirring his coffee. He placed a worn cowboy hat on the table beside him, its brim bent with years of use. Clint Eastwood, his face lined with deep creases, his gaze sharp and unwavering, looked like a monument defying time itself. He was one of the most recognizable faces in town. A career spanning decades had cemented his legacy, an image of grit, resilience, and unshakable determination. But now, away from the cameras and the lights, he was just a man lost in thought, seeming to enjoy a rare moment of solitude. But solitude isn't always possible. At the entrance of the cafe, a young girl hesitated. She wore a faded, oversized hoodie, her posture wary. She couldn't have been more than 13 or 14. Her curly, sun-bleached hair was tangled, and her pale, tired face told a story of too many sleepless nights. Her wide eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, carried the kind of weariness that only came from seeing too much, too soon. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped inside, her bare feet barely making a sound against the floor. She made her way toward Clint's table, pausing just a few feet away. For a brief second, there was silence. Then her voice, soft but steady, cut through the quiet. "Do you know who Jesus Christ is?" Clint's brow lifted slightly. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down, studying her. "That's quite a question," he muttered. "Just answer it," she said, her voice calm, but laced with something beneath the surface. An edge of unease, as if she were bracing herself for disappointment. "Do you really know him?" The cafe's usual hum of conversation softened. A few customers, sensing something unusual, turned their attention toward the exchange. Even the waitstaff slowed their movements, subtly tuning in. Clint inhaled deeply and leaned back in his chair. "Everybody knows him," he said at last. "But the real question is, do you?" The girl's lips parted, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out the chair across from him and cautiously sat down. Clint observed her closely. Her fingers, thin and trembling, rested on the table. Her nails broken, her hands stained with dirt. But what stood out most was her gaze. Her eyes held the weight of a childhood stolen by hardship, the kind of sorrow that no child should carry. "You know," she murmured, looking away, "maybe he wouldn't forgive me." Clint tilted his head. "Why wouldn't he?" She swallowed hard before answering. "Because I'm not a good person." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Clint took another sip of his coffee, then set the cup down, lacing his fingers together. "Who told you that?" he asked. Her response came instantly. "Everyone." Her tone was firm, but underneath it, there was something fragile. "Everyone who looks at me, people on the street, shop owners, cops, they see my dirty clothes, my hair, my empty pockets. I get hungry, I steal food. And that makes me a bad person, right?" The cafe fell even quieter. No one was pretending not to listen anymore. They weren't just overhearing a conversation. They were becoming part of it. Clint exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "You know," he said after a pause, "people used to say the same thing about me." For the first time, the girl looked up, intrigued. "Really?" Clint nodded. "Life has a way of pulling people down different road," he said. "You make mistakes. You take wrong turns. But that doesn't mean you're stuck on the same path forever. You always have a choice." The girl clenched her hands into fists on the table. Her eyes shone with something unshed, tears she refused to let fall. "But sometimes," she whispered, "it feels like there is no way out." Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. "There's always a way out," he said. "Sometimes you just can't see it yet." At that moment, a waitress approached their table, setting down a fresh cup of coffee in front of Clint. He glanced up at her, and she offered a small smile. "Would you like to order something for her?" she asked. Clint turned back to the girl. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Then let's get you a hot breakfast," Clint said. He nodded toward the waitress. who took the order and disappeared into the kitchen. The girl stared down at the empty table, then back at Clint. "Do you really think I can be forgiven?" she asked, her voice quiet but desperate for an answer. Clint nodded. "Forgiveness is usually easier than we think," he said. "But the hardest part is forgiving yourself." The girl fell silent, letting his words settle over her. Outside the window, people passed by, oblivious to the moment unfolding inside. The world moved on, as it always did. But here, in this small cafe, at this small table, something was happening. For perhaps the first time in her life, the girl wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was seen, heard. Clint took another sip of coffee, then set the cup down with finality. "Listen, kid," he said, "this is just a starting point, but what really matters is what you do next." And in that moment, for the first time, the girl truly began to think. The smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air as the waitress placed a steaming plate in front of the girl. Scrambled eggs, a side of toast, and crispy bacon. It wasn't much, but to someone who hadn't had a real meal in a while, it was a feast. The girl hesitated for a moment, glancing up at Clint as if waiting for permission. "Go ahead, Ryder," he said, tipping his coffee cup slightly in her direction. "Eat." She didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, she picked up the fork and started shoveling food into her mouth, chewing fast, as if afraid someone might take it away. Clint watched her silently, his eyes thoughtful but unreadable. The cafe was still buzzing, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. People were pretending not to listen, but their curiosity betrayed them. A businessman in a tailored gray suit, an elderly woman carrying a grocery bag, and even the young barista behind the counter, each of them stealing occasional glances at the unusual pair. Clint wasn't bothered. He had spent a lifetime being watched, analyzed, judged. This was nothing new. After a few moments, the girl slowed down, her hunger briefly satisfied. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve and looked up. "You said you were told you weren't a good person once," she said. "Why?" Clint set his coffee down, tapping his fingers against the ceramic rim for a moment before answering. "Because I made mistakes," he said simply. "Bad choices, hurt people I didn't mean to." The girl's brow furrowed. "What did you do?" Clint smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Let's just say, when you go through life thinking you're invincible, you start acting like nothing matters. And when nothing matters, you stop thinking about consequences." The girl nodded as if she understood. "Did you ever break the law?" Clint let out a dry chuckle. "Came close." She tilted her head. "So what changed?" Clint leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "I hit rock bottom." The girl swallowed, setting her fork down. "What does that feel like?" Clint took a long breath, his gaze drifting toward the street outside. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows now, stretching across the pavement like silent ghosts. "Like being in a dark room," he said, "and you don't know where the door is. You don't even know if there is one." The girl traced an invisible pattern on the wooden table with her fingertip. "That's how I feel all the time," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint looked at her, really looked at her. The way her shoulders slumped, the way her eyes carried an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. She was too young to be this tired. "Then you know what I'm talking about," he said. "But here's the thing about dark rooms." She glanced up. "What?" Clint's voice was calm, steady. "They all have doors. You just have to find them." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. The girl wrapped her arms around her tattered backpack as if it were a shield, her fingers gripping the frayed strap. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. Clint nodded. "Most people don't." She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of the quiet attention they were attracting. A woman near the entrance clutched her grocery bag a little tighter, her eyes glistening with something, maybe understanding, maybe regret. A young couple holding hands had stopped pretending to scroll through their phones and were just listening now. Even the gray-suited businessman, who had seemed lost in his own world moments ago, was now watching with quiet interest. The girl sighed. "People don't really notice me." Clint's expression didn't change, but his voice softened. They notice more than you think, she scoffed. No, they don't. They just see a homeless kid. Clint shook his head. They see a kid who's trying. The girl frowned. Trying what? Clint took another sip of his coffee before answering. Trying to figure out if she still belongs in this world. The words hit hard. The girl inhaled sharply, looking away as if she could physically escape them. But Clint didn't press. He let the silence do the work. A few seconds passed. Then finally she spoke. What if you're too broken to fix? Clint's jaw tightened slightly. He leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. You're not. She shook her head. You don't know that. Clint's gaze didn't waver. I do. The girl blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold something back. How? She whispered. Clint exhaled, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his coffee cup. Because I was. The girl stared at him, waiting for more. But Clint just let those 3 words hang in the air. The businessman shifted in his seat. The elderly woman dabbed at her eye with a tissue. Even the young barista at the counter had stopped pretending to clean and was now openly watching. Something had changed in the room. The girl swallowed hard. Did someone help you? Clint nodded. Yeah. She hesitated. Who? Clint's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A friend. The girl chewed on her bottom lip. What did they do? Clint met her gaze. They reminded me that I wasn't invisible. The girl exhaled sharply, like the wind had just been knocked out of her. For a long moment she just sat there, fingers tracing patterns on the table again. Then quietly she asked, what if I don't have anyone like that? Clint reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper and placed it on the table between them. You do now. The girl hesitated before picking it up. She unfolded it slowly. An address, a shelter not far from here, and below it, a phone number. She looked up at Clint, her hands shaking slightly. You'd really help me? Clint's voice was steady, unwavering. Absolutely, she swallowed. Why? Clint's expression softened. Because someone helped me when I needed it. She clutched the paper tightly, as if it were the most valuable thing she'd ever been given. A quiet sniffle broke the moment. The elderly woman near the door was openly crying now, her hands pressed to her chest. The businessman looked away, blinking rapidly. Even the barista had turned away, busying herself with the espresso machine. Clint sat back in his chair, watching as the girl stared at the paper, her eyes flickering with something new. Hope. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. And that changed everything. The girl stared at the piece of paper for what felt like forever. Her fingers traced over the ink as if she were trying to memorize the address just by touch. Clint Eastwood watched her in silence, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes sharp as ever. He had spent a lifetime reading people, knowing when they were about to run, when they were about to fight, and when they were just too damn tired to do either. The girl's hands trembled slightly. Then, without looking up, she muttered, What's your name? Clint raised an eyebrow. You don't know? She shook her head. Should I? For the first time, Clint let out a quiet chuckle. It was a strange sound, gravelly, like something unused for too long. Guess not, he said. She glanced up, chewing on the inside of her cheek. So? What is it? Clint leaned back in his chair, tilting his coffee cup between his fingers. Clint, he said finally. Clint Eastwood. The girl blinked. She tilted her head, studying him like she was trying to place the name. Then, to Clint's absolute surprise, she shrugged. Never heard of you. Someone at a nearby table gasped softly. The businessman in the gray suit looked like he was about to choke on his latte. Even the barista behind the counter turned around in disbelief. Clint smirked. He liked this kid. Well, he said, I've been around a while. The girl squinted at him. You a singer or something? Clint shook his head. Nah. Actor? He nodded once. She frowned. Like, movies? Yeah. She thought about it for a second, then shrugged again. I don't watch movies. Clint chuckled again, taking another sip of his coffee. Probably for the best. The businessman finally spoke up. leaning forward slightly in his chair. You seriously don't know who he is? He asked the girl. She turned to him, unimpressed. Should I? The businessman opened his mouth, then seemed to think better of it. He held up his hands in surrender and leaned back. Never mind. Clint shook his head, amused, but his eyes flickered back to the girl. She was still gripping the piece of paper like it was a lifeline, still shifting in her seat like she wasn't sure if she should stay or bolt. He set his cup down and folded his hands on the table. All right, kid, he said. Your turn. She frowned. For what? Your name. She stiffened. The shift in her body language was immediate. Her grip tightened on her backpack, her shoulders hunched slightly, and she cast a quick glance toward the cafe door. Clint didn't press. He just waited. A long moment passed before she finally spoke. Does it matter? She asked, her voice quieter now. Clint studied her. Names always matter. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. I don't use it much. Why not? She hesitated, then looked him dead in the eye. Because when people don't know your name, they forget about you faster. Something about the way she said it, so flat, so practiced, hit Clint harder than he expected. This wasn't just some throwaway thought. This was something she had learned, something she believed. She thought being forgotten was easier. Clint let out a slow breath, rubbing his chin. That's one way to look at it, he admitted. But I got a different theory. She raised an eyebrow. Yeah? People don't forget names. He tapped a finger on the table for emphasis. Not the important ones. The girl scoffed. I'm not important. Clint's voice hardened just slightly. Not true. She rolled her eyes. You don't even know me. Clint leaned forward. I don't have to. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Something in the way he said it made her pause. A long silence stretched between them. Then so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she muttered. Lena. Clint nodded as if the name had weight, as if it meant something even if she didn't believe it did. Nice to meet you, Lena. She shifted uncomfortably, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Don't say it like that, she mumbled. Clint raised an eyebrow. Like what? She shrugged. Like it matters. Clint tilted his head. It does. Lena let out a sharp breath, like she was frustrated with herself for even being here, for even talking to him. But she didn't leave. She just sat there, staring at the table. The businessman checked his watch, pretending not to be completely invested in the conversation. The older woman near the door was still holding her grocery bag, unmoving, her eyes locked on Lena like she wanted to reach out but didn't know how. Even the barista had stopped pretending to work. Clint finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. Why'd you ask me about Jesus? Lena shrugged, but it wasn't casual. It was defensive. People talk about him. And I don't know who he is. Clint's brow furrowed slightly. You never heard about him before? I mean, I've heard the name, but that's it. She hesitated, then admitted. I don't get why people care so much. Clint considered that for a moment, rubbing the rim of his coffee cup with his thumb. Because some people need to believe in something bigger than themselves. Lena frowned. Do you? Clint exhaled slowly. He didn't answer right away. Then after a long moment, he said, I used to. Lena studied him. What happened? Clint looked out the window, watching as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Life. The single word carried enough weight to silence the entire cafe. Lena shifted in her seat. For the first time since sitting down, she looked at him like she wasn't just asking out of curiosity. She was asking because she needed an answer. Because maybe, just maybe, his answer would help her find her own. Clint turned back to her, his eyes sharp but steady. You want to know what I think? Lena swallowed. What? Clint leaned in just slightly. I think maybe you're asking about Jesus because you want to believe in something bigger than yourself too. Lena's breath hitched. She looked away fast, shaking her head. That's not... It's okay, Clint interrupted gently. Nothing wrong with that. She was gripping the paper again, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep it or tear it up. Clint watched her carefully. Then just as she opened her mouth to say something, a voice from the crowd interrupted. Excuse me, the older woman near the door said softly, stepping forward. I needed to hear that today. Lena turned toward her, startled, and for the first time she realized people weren't just listening, they were feeling it. Lena's fingers tightened around the slip of paper in her hand. The older woman's words still hung in the air, like an echo that refused to fade. I needed to hear that today. She looked at the woman, really looked at her. Her face was soft, lined with age, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her grocery bag. There was something in her eyes, something Lena recognized. Pain. Not the kind that came from hunger or cold nights on the street, the kind that came from losing something. Lena swallowed hard and turned back to Clint. Why do they care? She asked, barely above a whisper. Clint took his time answering. He had spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully, knowing that sometimes the right sentence at the right moment could be more powerful than any action. Because they see something in you, he said finally. Something worth saving. Lena let out a quiet scoff, shaking her head. You don't even know me. Clint's expression didn't change. I don't have to. She looked at him, waiting for the usual doubt, the usual hesitation that people had when they tried to offer her sympathy. It wasn't there, and that scared her more than anything. Lena shifted in her seat, her knee bouncing under the table. I don't know if I can do this. Clint nodded as if he had expected that answer. That's okay. She blinked. It is? Yeah. He leaned forward slightly. No one's asking you to fix everything overnight. Lena looked down at the paper again, her thumb rubbing over the address. What if I go there and they turn me away? She asked. Clint didn't hesitate. They won't. Lena hesitated. And what if they do? Clint exhaled slowly, reaching into his pocket again. He pulled out a small battered leather wallet and flipped it open. From inside, he slid out another piece of paper, a business card. He scribbled something on the back with the pen the waitress had left on the table. Then he slid it across to her. If they turn you away, he said, you call me. Lena stared at the card like it was something foreign, something she didn't know how to hold. She looked up at Clint. Why are you doing this? Clint held her gaze. Because someone did it for me. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around both the slip of paper and the card. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't invisible. She was seen, heard, and maybe, just maybe, she mattered. Lena took a deep breath, then stood slowly, gripping her backpack like it was the only solid thing in the world. I should go, she said. Clint nodded. All right. She hesitated. You really think I can do this? Clint met her eyes, his voice firm but steady. I know you can. She swallowed hard. Then without another word, she turned and started walking toward the door. The cafe was silent as she passed through it. The businessman in the gray suit watched her go, his expression unreadable. The older woman near the entrance wiped a tear from her eye. Even the young barista had stopped moving, her gaze following Lena as she stepped outside. She didn't look back, but just before the door closed behind her, she hesitated, just for a second. Then she was gone. Clint sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. His coffee was cold now, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking about the coffee. He was thinking about Lena, about the way she had looked at him when he told her she mattered, about the way she had clutched that slip of paper like it was a lifeline. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, a long time ago. A quiet voice broke the silence. That was beautiful. Clint looked up. The older woman had stepped closer, her eyes still shining. I think you gave all of us something to think about today. Clint offered her a small nod. Sometime, he said, people just need to be reminded they're not alone. The woman smiled faintly. She'll remember this forever. Clint glanced toward the window, watching as Lena disappeared down the street. I hope so, he murmured. He stood up, dropping a generous tip on the table before grabbing his worn leather jacket. As he made his way to the door, he paused, glancing back at the cafe one last time. People were still watching him, still absorbing what had just happened. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once. Then he stepped outside into the golden light of the setting sun. And just before he walked away, he muttered to himself, no one is ever too broken to find their way back.